I just won't stop until both myself and the client are proud of the result. We're creating pieces of culture.
This day, we are super excited to have Michael DiTullo join us. And so, yeah, I think Michael, I think it would be kind of like best for you to kind of like introduce yourself for the people that don't know you, which I find hard to believe that there's someone in the world that doesn't know you, but
Or maybe I can at least set something straight.
yeah.
But no, hey, my name's Michael DiTullo. I'm an independent designer. I've had my own design practice for it'll be 5 years actually in 2 days from now, and we work with clients across almost every industry, mainly on what we kind of consider halo projects, really trying to push things forward. Prior to starting my own practice, I was chief design officer of a company named Sound United. I actually helped name the company, and that's a holding company. They own a bunch of different audio brands. At the time, they owned Polk, Definitive, and I was part of the deal team that helped them to purchase Denon and Marantz. They've gone on to purchase a bunch of other companies. Prior to that, I was creative director at Frog Design, one of the most legendary design firms ever. I was worked there for a few years, working on projects for Google, Motorola, Intel. But most notably, most people know me for the 8 years I spent at Nike, working across sportswear, the Jordan brand, where I worked directly with Michael Jordan, Carmelo Anthony, and a few other athletes. And then my last role there was as design director for Converse when they purchased Converse. And then I started my career as a consultant, working for a small consulting agency in Connecticut called Evo. Went to the Rhode Island School of Design, spent some time studying in Italy, spent a term studying at Cleveland Institute of Arts. But really, I think who I am underneath all those things is just a kid who loved thinking about the future. And when I was 13 years old, my parents asked me what I wanted to do when I grew up, and I said I wanted to draw stuff from the future for my job, and I think that's still a pretty good description of what I do. So underneath all those things, it's all about just getting to work on great projects with people.
Yeah, that's awesome. So at 13, you knew you wanted to do that.
I didn't know what it was called. I came from a pretty middle class family, and so there wasn't a lot of like exposure to design really in my life. But yeah, I just kind of instinctually was drawn to that, and I was really lucky. And a few weeks after I had made that statement, my dad showed me this newspaper article on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. There was an article about Giorgetto Giugiaro, the Italian industrial designer, and he was like, "Is this what you want to do?" And I was like, "Oh man, that's exactly it." And so all of a sudden, I knew what it was called.
Wow, that's really cool. Well, that's the thing with industrial design, right? Like even to this day, it's really difficult for people to understand what it is or to even know what it is. Like we have like our whole environment is full of industrially designed stuff and nobody knows that it exists.
Yeah, I was at a conference actually over the last weekend. At this conference called SAWC. It's for medical professionals, and I was with a client. They were debuting this medical product that I had worked on, and the client asked me to give a keynote talk to the conference. So I was presenting to a couple hundred doctors and practitioners, and I started the talk by just saying, "How many of you know what an industrial designer is?" And out of a room of 200 people, maybe two hands went up. And then I asked, "How many people know what an architect is?" Every single hand went up. I was like, well, if you think about what an architect does for buildings, and you think about what an apparel designer does for clothing, an industrial designer does that same thing for everything else. And I was like, just think of like the chair you're sitting in, the watch you're wearing, the glasses on your face, like all those things were touched for better or for worse by an industrial designer. Yet, like you said, there's just so little awareness of who we are.
Yeah, exactly. I wonder why that is. I don't know. Like we haven't been doing a really good job in branding it, or I guess.
Yeah, and it's interesting. As that kid, if I hadn't said that statement at that time, would my father have ever showed me that article, right? Or if he didn't read the newspaper that day, and so I talk to so many industrial designers who don't find it until later in life. Maybe they've already done a couple of years of an engineering degree and they realize this isn't what they wanted. And how many great designers are we missing out on as a profession because they're just not exposed to it? They just don't know.
Yeah, I agree. And it's kind of like really awesome of your dad that he kind of like kept thinking about it and in a way connected the dots, because like I think it's very different to see an article on a newspaper and
Right.
because it's something realistic. Probably like the thing that he saw was already a product that was being done, but you said you wanted to design things from the future, and somehow he connected the dots. And not only he connected the dots, he was also supportive of that, which is something that a lot of parents are not. Like,
It's
you
true.
want to draw for a living? Oh my god,
Yeah, and I remember the article. There was an image of him, and it was just like a little sidebar column article. But there was the image of Giugiaro, and then there was an image of a car he had designed, a tennis racket he did, a cruise ship, and a pasta that was designed to hold sauce better. And I was like, that's it. That's like exactly. I love that. And I think that's still me to this day. Because when I was a kid, I used to come home from school, and I was like a typical U.S. Gen X kid, like a latchkey kid. My parents were both working, and I'd come home from school, and I would get a snack for myself, and then open up the Sears catalog, right, which is this huge catalog that everybody got at the time. It's like I'm sure Amazon, but printed. And I would open up the catalog to a random page and be like, oh, power drills. I wonder what the future of power drills would be like, and be drawing on that for the day. I mean, I was basically like thinking like a designer before I even knew what it was. And I think kids do stuff like that, right? But they might not be encouraged, and then they just kind of put it away. But it's interesting because I feel like we as a profession, I say we, I mean all of us, we made more headway perhaps earlier in time. Like I think of Raymond Loewy was on the cover of Time magazine, right? Hartmut Esslinger, who founded Frog Design, was on the cover of Business Week. And so I feel like industrial designers were more in the forefront, more in people's minds in maybe in the 1960s. Yet nothing has changed. We still use chairs. We still use forks. Where I'm talking to you on a computer with a screen with a camera. All these things were designed, and so maybe we just kind of lost our swagger a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Although maybe, I mean, maybe not for the best, but not for the worst, because I
Sure.
do feel that there is a lot of, back then there was this kind of like, rock star sort of vibe for like the really, really big designers, and nobody else could kind of like enter this very, very small world, right? And I feel that now, even though we have become kind of like invisible, um, we're everywhere in a way, or like at least valued more, like in the different organizations that designers are working at. So, yeah, yeah, less kind of like cool brand, but more kind of like everywhere kind of thing.
And if so, that's great. And yeah, I think you're right. We don't want to over mythologize individuals, right? I mean, so yeah, it's a good point.
And so you started, were you good at sketching, or were you just very optimistic
I don't know.
when you started?
I think most kids, like every kid can draw, right? Like if you go into a kindergarten or first grade, you ask a bunch of 6-year-old kids to draw a fire truck. You ask 20 kids to draw a fire truck, you get 20 fire trucks, right? And you go to a high school and you ask 20 kids to draw a fire truck, most of them won't even do it. So something happens in there where kids start judging themselves, or their work is judged, and so they stop doing it. And so you can't improve if you stop doing it. You can't learn French if you don't speak it, right? So I think I was probably just as good as any other kid, but I just didn't stop drawing. And once I knew what it was called, right? It was called industrial design. I started just spending time in the bookstore in the design and architecture section. And I remember I found this book called Design and Rendering Techniques by Richard Powell, who's partner of Seymour Powell, the British design firm. And it was like it was like literally like, chapter one, get magic markers, T-squares, triangles. It was like everything you needed to like draw better, basically. And it was an expensive book. And I remember, my mom coming and being like, Michael, okay, we got to go. And I was like, I need this book. And it was, it was probably $70 at the time in the 80s, or probably was the late 80s. And she was like, I'm not going to buy this like $80 book, like on drawing. And I was like, no, I'm like not leaving. And I was a pretty good kid. So I think like the fact that I was so dug in, I was like, I'm not leaving here without this book. And that year for Christmas, I remember asking for a drafting table and like a set of professional markers. And so, I think it's not like I have any like magic innate talents. I think it's just that I just never stopped.
Yeah, that's something really important, because everyone, like there's two things, right? Like first, we get discouraged. Like there's this thing in society that like they just tell us, if you're not great at sketching, you shouldn't be doing it, but you can't really get great at it if you don't continue practicing. So there's this disconnect, and then we have all these people that have these kind of like ideas in their heads, and the best way to communicate them is visually, like somehow expressing themselves visually, but we're kind of like trained to just express ourselves verbally and like in written and spoken language. And so
visual communication is so interesting because it's a language, right? But in every other language, if you can hear it and decipher it, most likely you could speak it, at least to some degree. Some people can hear a language better than they could speak it. But I think the visual languages are even more so. Like everyone can read a picture of something, a rendering, a sketch to some degree. Some people struggle a little bit more, but yet so few of us can create those visuals. It's really interesting.
Yeah. You have to kind of like train your eyes and your hands and your brain and learn the laws of perspective, which is another thing. So there's many things involved, but it's about practicing. We have it in us. Yeah. And so your journey has been quite impressive, Michael. It's like it seems like you've been kind of like everywhere when it comes to designing an object. What has been your favorite kind of like industry or object that you have kind of like worked on?
That's a great question. I think I thrive actually in alternation, like whenever I loved working at Nike. I have so many friends there. But after 8 years of primarily doing footwear, I just felt like I wasn't as creative anymore. You start like, you know too much in a way. And I think some of the most innovative things I ever worked on there, I did in my first few years. And in fact, I think like within my first year, Metropolis magazine did like an article on like the 5 Nikes showing the way, like future of footwear. And I designed 3 of them in my first year there. And I don't think it's, again, no magic. It's just like I didn't know the rules, so I had an easier time breaking them. So for me, I really love alternating between things, and I feel like there's some magic cross-pollination there. Right now, the 3 most recent public projects that I've done that I really just like, all 3 of these projects are great examples of why I even started my studio. One was the Arc One, which is an electric speedboat that I designed the interior and exterior for the startup out of LA that's founded by all former SpaceX employees. The second is the Foot Defender, which is a leg brace for people with diabetes. That was the project I was presenting over the weekend. I had no idea people there's an amputation once every 30 seconds in the United States due to diabetes, and it's 100% preventable. And it's just something we don't even, yeah, it has to be treated. The pressure has to be like effectively relieved. And the products that are on the market don't effectively relieve the pressure. One, two, they're really hard to put on and off. And three, they just look terrible. And you have to wear this thing for like 8 months. So are you going to wear it to the grocery store? Are you going to wear it to work? So, we set out to conquer all three of those things, make it actually work, make it easy to put on and take off. And three, make it reduce the visual stigma. And that was a great project because it's like I got to use all my footwear skills for good. I also got to design the branding, the packaging, the product, the trade show booth. I took the product photography myself. So that was a really fun one. And then the third project that I'm so proud of is for a company in San Diego called Kire. And we partnered with Nike and we made these acoustic baffles for big open spaces, and they're filled with recycled Nikes. So all three of those couldn't be more different, right? Speedboat, a medical brace, and an architectural acoustic product. I'm working on at the same time, and I don't know. I just like the sparks are just flying for me, and that's what I love. I think it's not a particular category that I like working in the most. It's more of like a project type where it's just like, we're going to question everything, and it's going to be really hard. It's going to be an arduous journey, but we're going to summit the mountain at the end, and we're going to really like see a new sight. And that's kind of like what I live for.
Yeah, that's what drives you, making, proposing something really different. So I guess your process is really it starts with, let's forget everything we know kind of thing, or do you follow a regular process, or is it also kind of it changes?
I try to tailor it really to each client. I think, I've been doing this I've been a designer for 22, 23 years, and 13 of those years were in-house on the corporate side. So one of the things that frustrated me when I did work with consultants when I was on the corporate side is if they had a cookie cutter process. I'm like, that's not even, you're doing some stuff we don't need and you're missing other stuff we do need. So I tried to really take those learnings to my own practice and really tailor each project. It takes a little more time up front to get to know the client and the problem, but I think I really want to make sure that what we're giving them is what they need to bring the thing to production. So many times in the past, I've seen this thing where you hand off this beautiful design and then give it to the client and you're like, good luck, And I didn't want to do that. So processes are really different. Engagements look really different. But I think the thought process is the same. I come at every project respecting the client as the subject matter expert. And I'm to me, they're bringing me in because I'm the expert in creativity, right? So it's my job to kind of take as much of their knowledge as they possibly can and then show it back to them in a way they couldn't see it before. And so, sometimes we do ethnography at the start of projects. Sometimes it's intense competitive research. It just really depends on the project.
And so, but you're speaking about the client, but I guess the client also has their own clients, right? Their own users. And so I imagine there's a lot of research that happens. And is that a really important part of your process? I'm asking because I was kind of stalking you a little bit, and I found this video of you really long time ago. You designed this boot, this boxing boot.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you were describing, all the design decision and so on. And I remember you said something that, when the it had this thing in the shin that would kind of light up with lights, it was just this reflective material. And you said we put this here because every time somebody punches and the lights come on, then this thing will just kind of light up. And I was like, wow, this guy must have watched a lot of kind of like boxing matches. I don't know if it's a match or like, with boxing
Yeah,
things. So I
I'll tell
started
you.
thinking there's a lot of research going on in his head, and like just kind of like he's grabbing these very interesting like things that are happening.
And I'll tell you a secret. I don't like sports. I don't watch any sports. And I've worked with so many athletes, and I think well, as soon as they find that out, like they think that's hilarious. But I think it allows me to be a little objective. I'm not into boxing, but when I was that boot, the Macho Mai boot, which was designed for the Chinese Boxing Federation and has been gone on to be in many Olympics. It's been in production for like something like 10 years, which never happens for footwear. But the Chinese Boxing Federation came to Nike and they're like, they were boxing in this Adidas boot that was like 20 years old. And I was like, what do you like about this old boot? And they're like, it's super light. It's the lightest boxing boot in production because most boxing boots were like really built up for bigger boxers. It's very light and it's very breathable. So like we really just want this with a swoosh on it. And I was like, okay, well, you like that it's light, you like that it's breathable. I'm going to give you something more breathable. I'm going to give you something lighter, and it's not going to look anything like this. And so, yeah, I watched a few matches about how they box. They noticed like they moved a little bit differently, like the footwork was a little different. They moved like back, like their back shuffling was more. And so like I wrapped the traction up the side, up the back a lot more. I wrapped the traction in different ways. And then the boot was never designed to be mass produced. It was only meant to be. It basically have to be like a sponsored athlete to get this product. So you only ever see it on TV. So, and they move their feet so fast. So it's the biggest swoosh I think that ever went to production. It actually like the tail wraps all the way around to the other side of the shoe. Because I was like, you have to see it on TV quickly. So I love that. Yeah, I think everything, in a way, like everything's research. Like sometimes when I'm working on a project that's kicking off next week, I can't say what category it's in, but I was like just digging in on like Amazon reviews from their competitors. Like here's people telling you everything they don't like about the products. It's just, there's so much you can learn if you just look, I feel like.
Yeah, I think like a big part of being a designer is just always having your eyes open, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
It's a
almost
curse.
kind of like not agreeing with a lot of the things that are like how the world is now.
I agree. I think I've said this before, but I think all good designers have like the right level of dissatisfaction with the world. Like, because if you were satisfied, you wouldn't try to make things better. And if you're too dissatisfied, then you're just like, why even get up in the morning? It's just like just that right amount of like, I'm not satisfied with this, and to be frank, maybe a little bit of arrogance of like, and I think I can help make it better, or positivity maybe more than arrogance, but just that like I'm not happy with this, but I'm going to fix it instead of just complaining about it. And I think that's why most of my designer friends like we're so also obsessed with politics and current events, and it's just like you just see these things in the world and you're like, that's not right, that shouldn't be like that.
Yeah, and you start kind of like, your creative juices start flowing and there's always a solution to things. Yeah. Yeah, I would add to that yeah, it's kind of like also a bit of naiveness.
Yes.
Just thinking that, you can change the world, you can make things happen, you can just kind of like propose things and they will get made somehow.
Right. Well, it's
Yeah.
like that like when I was first working at Nike, it's just like I didn't know the rules, so it's just like I was that naivete, like, oh, I can just make a shoe fold up. Meanwhile, the engineers are like, this kid's insane. Making shoes that fold. Yeah. Was there some of that feeling for you with Gravity Sketch, where you're just like, hey, this thing that I want, this tool doesn't exist, and I'm just going to go make it? Was there a little bit of that dissatisfaction?
A lot. I mean, I was an industrial designer before becoming kind of like a founder, and so yeah, I was going through those pains of having to bring 3D ideas to life, and I mean, I had to go through the pains of like learning the processes, learning the software, learning everything so I could, get my ideas out. And I always thought that there was an easier way. And there was always this like, yeah, we can make it. We can, just like change things. Obviously, it's been 8 years. It doesn't happen from one day to the next. But, I guess that's where I like bring the naivety, like the naiveness into the picture. It's like, yeah, why not? Then you look back and you're like, it was a big mountain to decide to climb, but yeah, somebody has to do it. Somebody has to continue changing the world, and that's what creatives are for.
Yeah, I think that's how, I think so many things start that way. You think about like the founders of Nike or the founders of Apple, and they're just like, yeah, we could do it, and it goes somewhere. So I think certainly like what Gravity Sketch is doing, I think that's kind of like for people like me who came at this from drawing things, it's like, it seems like, yeah, I just want to be able to draw in 3 dimensions and express myself in another way, in a way that's quick, because I think one of the things that I love about sketching is that there's kind of a low commitment, right? There's like, you do a drawing. If I do a drawing and you hate it, like that's okay. I have to throw it up, crumple it up and throw it in the garbage, whatever. It took me 30 minutes. But if you build a CAD model that takes 40 hours and I show it to you and you're the client and you're like, I don't like it. You're like, oh, we're too far in, And so how can we bridge that gap between 2 and 3 dimensions to make the investment lower so we can experiment more?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you got it. Can you make a commercial for Gravity Sketch?
Well, we're recording this.
But yeah, that's absolutely the idea, because I mean, ultimately, why do we sketch? Like, why do we represent things like visually? It's because we want to bring those ideas out, because we want to be understanding them ourselves. Like, sometimes you don't have like clarity in your head. You have to kind of like doodle it around and be like, okay, cool, yeah. And then you just go into this creative flow, but also for other people to be able to bring some input into the process. That's ultimately the goal. Like, that's it. It's not meant to become like this piece of artwork. Some sketches are, but ultimately it's just a communication piece. So if you can bring more people into the communication quicker and with more information, then the products are going to be made faster. They're going to be better. More voices are going to be heard, which is, one of the things that you were touching on earlier is like, imagine how many designers there are out there that are not designers just because they didn't know that design existed. They didn't train themselves to, sketch or like all these different things, but they still have ideas, right? So, is there a way to democratize all of this and be able to bring more voices into the picture? Is there a way to bring voices that are usually not in the design studios, right? Like, we end up designing things for so many different types of people, but the people that are designing them are usually the same.
That's true. Very true. And I like to say like a rendering is a statement and a sketch is a conversation. And for me, I'm like I said, I'm not the expert. I'm usually not the consumer either. So I want to stay in that conversation space where I can show people ideas and they can give me feedback and I can adjust. Like I'm not an NBA player. I'm not somebody that would buy a $300,000 boat. I don't have diabetes. It's like but it's like, can I bring people into my process by showing them ideas quickly and adjusting. That's kind of my goal with my process. Like I love to collaborate and I know I'm not an expert. I'm not a genius. I'm just someone who really likes to move things forward. I love Raymond Loewy's definition of design. I think he said it's a little logic, a little taste, and the willingness to collaborate. And then, like you said, how do we ultimately not just make people a part of that process, but help people that don't look like me, who aren't 45-year-old white guys, become designers? Because, diversity of thought and a diversity of experience is going to make this profession a lot stronger. And, like there's so many people who buy sneakers, and oftentimes the people that design those sneakers don't look like them, right? And there should be a lot more representation, a lot more equal representation, in my opinion.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I was reading this book that's called Invisible Women. I don't know if you've read it.
I've heard of it, but I've not read it yet.
Really recommend it. But yeah, it lists basically just gives a lot of facts on like different things that have been designed, but not thinking about women, and not because like men are like evil. It's just because you think how you think, because those are the experiences that you have in your head, right? You can do research, but it's never the same.
Well, and I think culturally, for generations, it has been acceptable for men to dictate like a solution, and not even maybe not even get input from the people they're designing for, and this is not right.
Yeah, exactly. So changing gears a little bit, I want to hear a little bit about the boat project that you just finished. Can you speak a little bit about it?
Sure. Yeah, it was a dream project. I think, again, I love working on these projects and learning so much. Like with the diabetes project, the brace for people with diabetes, just like this huge problem that affects so many people. Like 1 in 3 Americans is now pre-diabetic. Like this affects so many people. Again, with the boat project, learning, like I had no idea that most boats, this is a 24-foot boat, most boats in that class only get about 1 mile to the gallon. So just like incredibly inefficient, right? And then like they're out on the water, the huge engines that take up a huge portion of the usable space on the boat that are like crazy noisy. So now like they're making, gas and oil pollution, they're leaky, and they're noisy. And then they also require so much maintenance, right? Like maybe you're only using it for 6 months of the year. You have to take it out of the water, drain all the fluids, maintain those motors. So the idea of making this boat electric makes a lot of sense. It's like zero maintenance. You literally can just charge it up and go. 1, 2, the motor is silent. So now you're just like hearing the water, and it's driven electrically. So as long as you're charging that with a good source of electricity, it's much cleaner. So anyway, it was so cool to try to like, okay, how do we bring this to life? Like we had to make it, you had to like walk that balance between like, on one hand, we wanted to just look like a beautiful boat. But on the other hand, I also want people to instinctually understand that there's something a little different about this. And so, the way we worked with the material, like these are all SpaceX engineers, so they're forming aluminum. It's not a composite boat, so like, okay, I have to design for the manufacturing technique. We have to design for the category to make something beautiful and elegant for the category, but also trying to think of like graphically, what's the statement we can make across the water. So I pulled actually there's something in footwear, specifically typically in basketball shoes, called a 50-50 block, where it's like half dark, half light. And I was like, I'm going to pull the 50-50 block into the boat. And so there's this graphical line that goes from the windscreen and then cuts at an angle across all the cross sections of the boat, so you can really see the cross section of it, and splits the boat, white to dark gray. And so it's really striking graphically. And the first time they ever took it out on a lake to test it, they were pulling it up out of the water, and somebody came up and was like, "Is that an electric boat?" And I love that. Like that's just like, we nailed it. Like just the person knew it was an electric boat without having to put a lightning bolt on the side, And then the other cool thing was, because the motor, an electric motor, is tiny, right? So, and the batteries are below the deck. So the entire deck is just people space. So I got to design this really fun seating arrangement, kind of like we call it the J bench, kind of wraps its way around the boat and then makes this kind of J shape. And so you could fit like so many more people on this thing because everything is kind of below the floorboards. So anyway, I love working on it. Also, it's always really fun to work with a startup where you're making, this is like their first baby, right? And you're like helping to bring that first baby into existence for them. That's going to kind of like set the tone for all the future products. So really great. And working with engineers, right? So they don't necessarily have that aesthetic vocabulary. So helping to teach them like, how do we talk about aesthetics and what are the functions of the aesthetics? Like, what are the meanings that we're trying to convey through line and form and color? So anyway, it was a fun one, as you could tell. I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, I can tell. And so, there aren't that many, or is it the first electric boat? No, right?
There are a few others. I think it's kind of the only one in this class. Like a lot of the other electric boats are more like little things to kind of just get you around the lake slowly. And then there are a few hydrofoils that are like more for speed. This one is more, I would say, probably one of the first ones that's meant for like water skiing and water sports, and can fit, 10, 12 people comfortably.
Wow, this is amazing. And yeah, it sounds like a really interesting project because you had to learn a lot, I guess, about boats and about electric boats. And so did they give you just kind of like the package and you had to figure out how to design around it, or were you also part of how some of the components would be arranged?
Yeah, the package I was brought in really early, so the package was being defined at the time. And then, like I knew we were going to do it as part of the brief we did like a closed hull boat, and that the batteries were going to go below decks. So I knew kind of like I had a pretty blank sheet other than not violating those battery packs, and then the kind of from the water line down is obviously very much defined by fluid dynamics. But, what we're doing above the water line is interacting with that. So working with the hull engineers to get everything to kind of do what it's supposed to do, especially with a water ski boat or a wakeboard boat where you want a very specific wake shape out the back of the boat, the way the water is shaped out the back. And then I was trying to do some things that maybe hadn't been done before. Usually a lot of these boats have what's called a swim platform, basically like a ledge that you could sit on to get into the water off the back, but they're literally like bolted on. And I was just like, I want to make this, kind of a typical designer thing. I want to integrate all the components so that it's one shape. But doing that affected the wake. So it was just like really, really balancing that out with the engineers. And I love that. I love that kind of back and forth. And getting down to like the littlest thing in the interior, like with a lot of products like this, there's a lot of off the shelf components you can specify. And so, initially like the first boat, they went with an off the shelf throttle. And I was like, we really need to do a custom throttle. And I'm like, cause this is the thing like you touch, this is the thing that connects to the electric motor. And this needs to it needs to uphold like the rest of the design needs to come right into that part. And so working with them to be like, okay, like how are we going to make this custom throttle and like, what's it feel like? How's it made? So I love that. One of the first exercise I did with them actually was we wrote a press release together. And I think they were like, why is the industrial designer having us write a press release? Like the first in the kickoff workshop with the two founders, we wrote the press release for the project. And the title, we gave it a headline. And when the boat was public, I believe Bloomberg was it was like Bloomberg and The Verge and a few other outlets were the first ones to pick up the story. And the Bloomberg headline was almost exactly the headline we wrote together.
Because you gave it to them, or just like out of...
No, I mean Bloomberg wrote the headline themselves, but it's just I think everything was just like we were so centered around this vision, right? I've like, and I really wanted them to envision like what does launch day feel like, and what are people saying, and so I think because my experience in this case, I was just doing the industrial design, though it's boats, there's a lot of industrial design to do. I always want to be leveling that up to like, what does that mean for this company? What does that mean culturally? Like, what are we trying to do in the world?
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, you were setting kind of like the pace for the entire design language and design culture within the company.
Hopefully, yeah. I think it's
Yeah.
going to be just the first of many products for them. So, and it's been awesome to see the reception it's been getting, and it continues to just get press. So it's definitely one of those projects. Like my wife, who's my life partner and my business partner, she's like, "This is why we started the studio for you to do projects like this." So,
Yeah, she could see you very happy, I guess.
yeah, yes.
Just enjoying it. And so, Michael, what makes Michael Michael? Because I mean, maybe you don't know, but maybe you do. But you know, like it's, you know, you're doing the same as any other designer, right? You're sketching, you're like making, like having like conversations with customers, idea generation, and so on. But like, there's, you know, what makes you you?
I think I just tend to be a combination of optimistic and pragmatic. I really want to, like I said before, really push things forward and make things that are memorable. Like I just won't stop until both myself and the client are proud of the result. And I think it's because I see what we do as, of course, we're satisfying a business need, right? We're creating something that makes money. One, two, we're satisfying functional needs. Hopefully, we're solving a real problem for real people. And those two things are really important. But third, I think we're creating pieces of culture, right? We're creating things that are in culture. And maybe it comes from my time at Nike, but just understanding like the objects that are around us, they make up our landscape, right? Like people, they don't have Picasso paintings and they don't live in Frank Lloyd Wright homes. They have these humble things around them that makes up their life. And so can we create something that speaks to something a little higher, that maybe inspires them a little bit? I think that's what separates me. I'm really pushing for that. And, I think of what we do as like, we're creating the artifacts of tomorrow. When you go to an art museum and you go to, if you go to the Met in New York and you go to the Egyptian wing or the Asian wing, like you see there's art, but there's also a lot of like just things from everyday life, bowls and everyday objects. And that's what we're doing. 1,000 years from now, 2,000 years from now, will they look back at these things and try to infer what our life was like. So I don't know. I think that kind of thinking maybe it's overthinking, but it separates me a little bit.
Yeah, what you say is very true. It's like it's the like basically the objects around us are the things that are just shaping our lives, and in a way, it's the designer's responsibility to make these things, functional, but also like visually pleasing and somehow kind of like creating a better space for whoever is using them. But
Yeah.
and so that brings me to another question that I have for you is, you have been in the industry for a long time. I'm not saying that you're old, but you have been in the industry for a long time.
I'm on the young side of old. Yeah.
And so design has changed quite a bit. Maybe design as a practice hasn't, but the objects that are being designed are changing, right? You just designed an electric boat, 20 years ago, nobody actually spoke about electric boats probably, or like very few people. There's constantly a lot of objects that are now shaped as a box because their function is not necessarily like physical, it's more digital. Like, so how do you see industrial design changing? Because a lot of the things are going in that direction. There's a lot of technology going into them. There's artificial intelligence going into them as well. And so, there's something happening, I think.
Yeah. I'm actually I graduated design school in 1998. and I feel really lucky to have been at that moment because I kind of got both educations, right? Like we learned how like day one of design school was like setting up a May line on a drafting table, right, and a parallel rule, and so we were doing everything by hand, drafting by hand. But yet by the time I graduated, we were taking classes in Form Z, which is a very primitive CAD modeling, and Illustrator, Photoshop classes. And at this point, Illustrator was so primitive, like you had to work in the wireframe mode, and then like you would hit Command Y, and then it would like render out your Illustrator because it was just anyway. It was, but I kind of got this like, this bridge moment, and when I first graduated school, like we were still sending draftings like by hand, like full size draftings and folding them and shipping them, and we were faxing sketches. We thought that was amazing. Well, we could just fax the sketches because you couldn't attach email couldn't handle big attachments. So I feel like I've really seen the practice of design change quite a bit. Like the tools we use now compared to 1998, it was 24 years ago, are so different. I mean, sure, we still sketch, but most of the time I'm sketching on a Cintiq or iPad, and joining clients. I have no local clients. All my clients are all over the place, and like joining them virtually most of the time. And so, we're in a change industry, right? Like what we do is change. Like our job is to help companies change. And so we need to remember that rule applies to us too. Like the things we design are changing. The way we design art is changing. And I think that's the cool part about it. Like every day is different. I don't really have like a day, like every day, my day is different than the day before. And so that's what I love. And so I think if you're going to have a long career in design, I think it helps to embrace that. And I think the people I see who burn out, they become very good at one thing, and then they just they crush under the weight of that. Either they get overtaxed by doing that one thing, or things change and now like they're maybe not as relevant as they were. And so again, for me, I've just kind of invested my time into being an expert at creativity, an expert at collaboration, and everything else is changeable.
Yeah, I love that. So I imagine you're constantly changing your tool set and you're just like learning new things constantly.
I think it helps, I think, this is a very rudimentary version, but when I was working at my first job, out of school, Evo Design, the design director there was Aaron Szymanski. And sometimes like I'd just be like drawing with like a Prismacolor pencil and just like be stuck in a rut. And he would take my pencil and be like, "Here, draw with this Sharpie for a few hours." And like there's something it does. And that's a very simple tool change, right? That's not like going from 2D to 3D, but it does jog things, like the way you see things differently. And so, yeah, I think it's important. And it's important to balance that, because sometimes I see things that were designed a certain way because of a tool. You're like, oh, did you want to design it that way? Or is that just how you could use the tool? So I try to abstract away the tool from the idea. Like I want to come up with the idea, do whatever it takes to come up with the best idea. And then I'm like, okay, now I figure out how to like build that out.
Yeah, sometimes you can really tell like the software that somebody used to design an object, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah, you could see the eras of software if you like, dig through like the eras of industrial design, like from the late 90s to today. You could be like, oh, like this is when NURBS became a thing. This is what you could see it.
Yeah, yeah. And so, what do you think makes a design iconic?
I think it's, I don't think there's any prescriptive visual thing that makes it iconic, because it's very relative to what's around it. One of my favorite pieces of design and architectural criticism was, I was reading some criticism about the Guggenheim in New York when it was first built, and the critic said, "You know what's the best thing about the Guggenheim is it's the only Guggenheim on the street." And I love that. Like, you know, his point was like it's in the it's on the Upper East Side in New York City, right? So it's on like Central Park, and then there's all these like very traditional buildings all around it, and then all of a sudden this white spiral. So if the street was filled with white spirals, it wouldn't be very iconic, right? But it's the contrast that makes it iconic, right? The contrast of like nature and built environment, and then like old buildings, and wow, like the future. Yeah, and so I think there's something to that, the juxtaposition of things, that makes something iconic. I also think if I was to put a more slightly prescriptive lens on it, you know, I was thinking about Tinker Hatfield, one of the most famous footwear designers, designed the original Nike Air Max and Jordans 3 through 15. You know, I was asking him a similar question of like, what makes a great design? What makes an iconic design? And he's like, every iconic design can be drawn with 5 lines. And I think there's something to that. Like, you know, there's something to like a clearness of purpose, of restraint, of a confidence that comes with reducing something down, not necessarily being minimal, right? Because sometimes these things there could be a lot, but there's still just like this. I mean, it's in the word. You said iconic. There's something where you can create an icon of it in your mind. Like you think about like the Volkswagen Beetle, and you're just like, yeah, I know it. I know what that shape is, even if I couldn't get every line right. So I think there's something there to creating something that is boiled down to its most pure essence that you can. And for me, I don't know what it takes for other people, but for me, a lot of that just takes time, right? Like I have to go nuts, and then I have to pull things off, and I like pull things off until it breaks, you know?
Yeah. Okay. So that's part of your process, just like, you know, removing things until you're left with the very essence kind of thing.
Yeah, and sometimes the client doesn't see that, right? I'm kind of doing that in private, in my doodles and my sketches, and then, you know, I'm presenting to them different approaches, but I try to to the client, it usually looks effortless, but there's a lot of effort went into it.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's like I did put a lot of work, even though it feels simple, like a promise.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember I worked on this AirPlay speaker that's basically like a black rectangle with a machined aluminum base with this like cantilever. It had this UI, that's this machined aluminum UI that kind of cantilevers out at a right angle from the product. But anyway, the client was like, I loved it. And then we went out to dinner afterwards, and he's like, yeah, I realized like you just charged me a lot of money for a black rectangle. He's like, but it is right. Like I can't. It's just right. It's like iconic. And so, but it just takes a long time to get there sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. You have to go like the whole way to get to that like very simple thing.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I need to relearn the lesson every time, it feels like, but
that's part of the process, no? It's
right.
just like you have to figure it out for that every specific thing. And so I have a question that has been in my mind, like how is it? Like you mentioned, you don't know anything about sports. Like I'm kind of like the same. I don't watch sports besides the World Cup, just when Mexico is playing.
Yeah, nice. That's culture. That's like cultural, right? Like where sport is intersecting culture.
Exactly. It's like more of a party than anything. And so you had to learn a lot when you were at Nike, I imagine, when you were, you know, working with athletes. How was that? Like, did you become kind of like this expert in like figuring out how to learn, how to observe them? How was it, for example, working with Michael Jordan? Like, were you asking some like very specific questions? Like, you know, how was that experience?
I think they appreciated it because they get so many people that, you know, are so excited to be around them, which must be amazing, but also tiring. And I remember once, the first time I was ever presenting to Carmelo Anthony, I was presenting, I was getting ready to present and was making some small. This is the first time I ever really met him. And he was like, Did you see me play last night?" And I was like, "No, did you see me draw the shoe last night?" And it was like the room was like dead quiet for a second, and then he's like busted out laughing, and he was like, "I love this guy." And I was just like, I think it's just that feeling of like, I'm here to work with you, And so I will watch them play. I love to like go like watch them practice and just like see them, do what they do. I remember one time I was working on this shoe for Derek Jeter, who was on the New York Yankees, and before a game, we just linked up in his suite, and he was literally just like watching Little League baseball on TV, and we're just chatting, and he's like, what makes this kid good? Like, look at what this kid's doing, and look at what this kid's doing, and just getting insights into their minds, and also just like I try to like, this is a tool for them, right? This is a tool for them to do their job, the product that we're making. But it's also like intensely personal because all these kids are going to go buy this product. And I was always trying to hide little hidden things. I hope I get the numbers right, but when I was working on Derek Jeter's shoe, I was asking him like, "Oh, who was your hero like when you were growing up?" And he was like, "Oh, Dave Winfield on the Yankees was my hero." And I was like, "Oh, I remembered that," and looked up Dave Winfield, and I remembered because Derek and I are about the same age, and I remembered, and I grew up in New York, so I remembered Dave Winfield as a player. And I think his number was 41, so I put just like 41 like ventilation perfs on the side of the shoe, but two of the perfs were bigger, and 2 is Derek Jeter's number, and when I showed Derek the shoe, he was like, "Hey, how come these 2 holes are bigger than the rest of the holes? So it looks weird." And I was like, "Well, there's 41 holes." And he was like, "Dave Winfield's number." And he's like, "Yeah." And he's like, "2's my number." And then he was just like, "I love that." And just like, he was just like, his eyes lit up, and he's just like, "Oh man, like you remembered this, paid attention to me." So I don't know. I love to just do that for them. Just like hide these little things in there that like make them feel it's more special. And maybe that's a story that reaches the kid at some point too, right? And so
Yeah, exactly. And even if it doesn't, like there's this hidden thing that you and the athlete shared, and like, when the athlete is using the shoe, like they know, it's, yeah.
yeah,
Love
like
that.
John Hoke, who's the chief design officer at Nike. I remember once he's like, "Michael, you know what I love about all your work?" He's like, "Every time I look at your work, I feel like there's a wink and a smile in it." And I remember I did this one pair of Jordans. I was on the Beatrice, I think was that model, and on like the left shoe, I had like a two perforations when you look down at the bottom of the laces, and that on the right shoe there was 3. And John was like, "You messed up. Like, why is there 2 here? There's 3 here." And he's like, "Oh, 23, Michael Jordan. Got it." Like I just love those little moments that like they're free, right? Like it's just all it costs is thought. Didn't cost any more to do that. And I love hiding things in designs that maybe you don't find until 6 months later, and you're like, "Oh my God, like look at this. Like I thought of this." So I don't
And
know.
I can just picture you like waiting for the moment when they find out.
Yeah, and maybe that's like the 13-year-old kid in me. That's just like the like being childlike, kind of a thing.
Yeah. So you've had a great career, Michael, something that many designers wish they had, and many aspiring designers or designers that are just getting started, they wish that sometimes they will end up having a career like yours. What would you tell them? Like, are there any kind of like tricks that you now know? Can they kind of like, cheat the system a little bit and like get quicker to to where you are?
But there's definitely 2 or 3 things that have really guided me. The first is that your own definition of yourself is your most precious thing. People will always try to put you into a box. They'll try to say, Michael's this, Daniela's that. And that's not true unless you allow it to be true. And you can decide if it's true or not. I remember when I started at Nike, like my second or third week or whatever, they gave me my business cards, right? And it said Michael DiTullo, footwear designer. I was like, oh, I said, and my boss gave it to me, like, excited. It's a big deal to get your cards when you're there. And I was like, you have to shred these. And he was like, what do you mean? I'm like, because they say footwear designer. And he's like, you are a footwear designer. I'm like, no, I'm a designer. I work for a footwear company, makes footwear. And I'm not a footwear designer. That's not all I could do. I could do everything. And so controlling that definition of yourself is so important. The same when I was interviewing at Frog, I brought, a bunch of work that I had produced and had it on the table. And one of the other creative directors came in to interview me, and he was like, footwear guy, blah. And I was like, nope, I'm not a footwear guy. I'm an industrial designer running a team for, my team is responsible for $120 million of business annually, working for one of the top 3 brands in the world, creating industry-leading product. If Frog Design's not interested in that, please let me know right now. This interview's over. I don't want to waste my time. And he was just like, no, I'm sorry. I got a job offer that day, but it's just like, no, I'm not going to let you define me, So one, control the definition of yourself. 2, you have to have a long-term vision, right? Like, it's not enough to have a 3-year plan, to have a 5-year plan. You should have a 20-year vision for who you are. And if you're right now, if you're just graduating school and you're 22 years old, well, you'll still be younger than me at the end of that 20 years. And I still have another 20 years ahead of me. So it's like, you have to remember, like, what we're doing is long, right? You're going to be doing this for a while. And so you need to be thinking about how do you build towards your vision of yourself? One of my mentors said, it's like a child building a tower out of wooden blocks. You don't just take 5 blocks and throw them and expect them to make a tower. It will never make a tower. You have to put 1 block down and then another and then a third, fourth, the fifth, and then you get a tower. So you have to have that long-term vision for yourself, and you have to build towards it. And then I'd say that the third thing, so definition of yourself, long-term vision. The third thing is you'll also have to be flexible, because things will happen in the world. We'll have a global pandemic, right? Like, opportunities will come your way that you didn't expect. And you do have to have the flexibility to adjust. Another one of my mentors said this to me. He's like, opportunities don't come when you're ready. They come when they're ready. And so it might be a little before you're ready for them, or it might be a little after you're ready for them, but you have to recognize it and go for it when it comes your way. So those would be the 3 things that I would say have guided me.
That's awesome. That's really good advice. Thanks, Michael.
Yeah.
And I hope it's useful for everyone that is listening. Well, thank you so much, Michael, for your time. It has been kind of like a great conversation to have with you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I just really love talking about what we do and sharing it. So thank you for giving me the platform to talk today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, the pleasure is ours. All right, well, bye-bye, Michael.